They called her the mistake, the recruit who cried during drills, the soldier who froze during simulations. General Hartwick even wrote in her file, emotionally unstable, recommend discharge. But on a frozen November morning in the Czech mountains, when an entire battalion was trapped and command had given up hope, it was Irene Hill who walked into the storm alone. Not because she was fearless, but because she understood something no one else did. Sometimes the broken ones know exactly how to find the lost. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The autumn rain fell steadily on the training grounds of Firebase Dante, a European military installation nestled in the mountains near the German-Czech border. Irene Hill stood at attention in the mud, her uniform soaked through, her hands trembling not from cold but from the weight of yet another failure. "Hill," Lieutenant Commander Brennan's voice cut through the rain like a blade. "You froze again. Third time this week. What's your excuse this time?" Irene opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Around her, the other recruits stood silent, their eyes carefully averted. They'd learned months ago not to associate too closely with her. Failure, it seemed, was contagious. "No excuse, sir," she finally managed, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. Brennan stepped closer, his weathered face tight with frustration. "Hill, you've got the worst performance scores in your entire cohort. Your physical assessments are adequate, your written exams are exceptional, but when it comes to actual field exercises, you fall apart. Every single time." It was true. Irene excelled at everything that didn't involve real-world pressure. She could memorize tactical manuals, ace strategic planning tests, and outperform most of her peers in technical skills. But put her in a simulation with gunfire sounds and shouting, and something inside her simply shut down. The other recruits called her the weeper behind her back, though never to her face. They'd seen her break down too many times during high-pressure drills, seen the tears she couldn't control, the panic attacks that left her gasping for air in the barracks bathroom. At 23, Irene had joined the European Defense Initiative with dreams of making a difference. She came from a small village in the Czech countryside, where her father had served before her, where military service was seen as the highest calling. But those dreams felt increasingly hollow with each failed exercise. That evening, as the recruits filed into the mess hall for dinner, Irene sat alone at a corner table. She'd grown accustomed to the isolation. It was easier than seeing the mixture of pity and contempt in her colleagues' eyes. "Did you hear?" someone whispered at the next table. "General Hartwick is coming tomorrow to observe our final qualification exercises." Irene's stomach dropped. General Victoria Hartwick was a legend, a decorated commander known for her uncompromising standards and her ability to identify potential in young soldiers. She was also known for her brutal honesty. If Hartwick observed tomorrow's exercises and saw Irene's performance, it would likely mean the end of her military career. She pushed her food around her plate, appetite gone. Through the mess hall windows, she could see the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Somewhere up there, beyond the comfortable confines of Firebase Dante, was the real world, where real soldiers did real work. A world she was increasingly certain she'd never be part of. After dinner, Irene returned to her bunk and pulled out a worn notebook from her footlocker. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, observations she'd been making for months. While her peers spent their free time socializing or resting, Irene had been studying something different: the psychology of crisis response, the patterns of human behavior under extreme stress, the ways people broke down and the ways they could be brought back. It had started as a way to understand her own failures. Why did she freeze when others acted? What triggered her panic responses? But as she delved deeper, reading every psychology manual she could access, interviewing medics about combat stress, even corresponding with civilian therapists, she'd begun to see patterns that went beyond her personal struggles. She'd noticed, for instance, that during rescue simulations, the standard protocols often failed because they didn't account for the psychological state of the people being rescued. Traumatized individuals didn't respond rationally to commands. They needed something different, something more intuitive and empathetic. But who would listen to theories from someone who couldn't even complete a basic field exercise without falling apart? Irene closed the notebook and lay back on. her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, General Hartwick would watch her fail one final time. And then, mercifully, this whole nightmare would be over. What she didn't know was that tomorrow's exercise would be interrupted by a real emergency, and that her years of secret study, combined with the very emotional sensitivity that everyone saw as her greatest weakness, would become the key to the most important mission Firebase Dante had ever faced. The morning dawned cold and clear, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Irene stood in formation with her cohort, her heart hammering against her ribs as General Hartwick walked slowly down the line of recruits. The general was exactly as Irene had imagined, tall, steel-haired, with eyes that seemed to look straight through you and catalog every weakness. She paused briefly in front of each recruit, occasionally asking a question, sometimes just nodding before moving on. When she reached Irene, she stopped for a longer moment. Irene forced herself to maintain eye contact, though every instinct screamed at her to look away. "Hill," Hartwick said, her voice neither warm nor cold, simply factual. "I've read your file." "Yes, ma'am," Irene replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Impressive test scores, some of the highest I've seen." Hartwick paused. "Also some of the worst field performance ratings I've encountered." "Care to explain the discrepancy?" Irene had prepared several answers to this inevitable question. She could talk about adjustment issues, about needing more time, about working to improve. But standing before this woman who'd built a career on seeing through pretense, those rehearsed responses felt hollow. "I struggle under pressure, ma'am," she said simply. "I know what to do, but when the moment comes, I freeze." Hartwick studied her for another moment, then nodded curtly and moved on. But Irene caught the expression that flickered across the general's face before she turned away. Not contempt, not disappointment, but something that looked almost like recognition. The exercise was scheduled to begin at 0900 hours. It was a standard search and reconnaissance drill. Teams would be deployed into the mountain foothills to locate and report on simulated enemy positions. Irene had been assigned to Team Delta, led by a capable recruit named Victor Steiner, who'd made no secret of his frustration at having her on his squad. "Just stay out of the way," Victor told her as they prepared their gear. "If you freeze up, find cover and wait for extraction. Don't compromise the whole team." Irene nodded, swallowing her humiliation. She'd heard variations of this speech many times before, but as Team Delta prepared to deploy, an alarm began to sound across the base. Not the standard exercise alarm, but the emergency klaxon that meant something real was happening. Lieutenant Commander Brennan's voice crackled across the base intercom. "All personnel to DS, Command Center. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." The training exercise was immediately suspended. Recruits and officers rushed toward the command center, speculation rippling through the crowd. Real emergencies were rare at Firebase Dante, which primarily served as a training facility. Inside the command center, chaos reigned. Radio operators worked frantically at their stations, while officers clustered around a large tactical display. General Hartwick stood at the center of it all, her expression grave. "Listen up," Hartwick's voice cut through the noise. "At 0600 hours this morning, a civilian research team failed to check in from their weather station in the Kenosha Mountains. Initial investigations suggest they may have been caught in an early snowstorm that came through the peaks overnight." She pointed to the tactical display, where a red marker indicated a location deep in the mountains. "The station is here approximately 40 kilometers northeast. We've lost all communication. Czech Mountain Rescue is mobilizing, but they're dealing with multiple emergencies from the storm. They've requested our assistance." Irene felt her chest tighten. This was real. Not a simulation, not a drill. Real people trapped in the mountains. "The challenge," Hartwick continued, "is that the standard approach route is now blocked by avalanche debris. We need to find an alternate route and deploy a rescue team immediately. Weather conditions are deteriorating, and we have perhaps 6 hours before the next storm system moves in." She turned to face the assembled personnel. "I need experienced climbers, personnel trained in mountain rescue, and anyone with knowledge of the Krkonoše terrain. Several officers stepped forward, but Irene found herself frozen again, not from fear this time, but from a sudden, overwhelming certainty. She knew something about the situation, something important. The Krkonoše Mountains had been part of her tactical studies. She'd analyzed every map, every trail, every potential approach route as part of her obsessive preparation. And more importantly, she'd read extensive reports about the psychological effects of being trapped in extreme weather conditions. The panic, the disorientation, the irrational decisions that often led to worse outcomes. "Ma'am," she heard herself say, her voice cutting through the room. Everyone turned to look at her. Victor was staring at her with wide eyes, clearly shocked that she'd spoken up. Brennan's expression darkened. General Hartwick raised an eyebrow. "Yes, Recruit Hill?" Now that she had everyone's attention, Irene felt the familiar panic beginning to build. Her hands started to shake. Her breathing became shallow, but she forced herself to continue. "Ma'am, I've studied the Krkonoše terrain extensively. There's an alternate route through the Labska Valley that could work. It's longer, but it bypasses the avalanche zone entirely." Hartwick moved closer to the display. "Show me." Irene stepped forward on trembling legs and traced a route on the tactical map. Her finger moved confidently despite her shaking hands, marking waypoints and potential hazards. "This route adds approximately 4 kilometers, she explained, her voice growing steadier as she focused on the technical details. "But it follows stable terrain and provides better protection from wind exposure. The research station can be approached from the eastern ridge rather than the standard southern approach." Several officers studied the route, nodding thoughtfully. But before anyone could respond, Brennan spoke up. "General, with respect, Hill has never completed a field exercise successfully. Her analysis might be sound on paper, but nothing, Commander," Hartwick interrupted. "Right now, I need sound analysis, not field performance scores." She turned back to Irene. "What else?" Irene took a breath. This was the part that would sound crazy. "Ma'am, if the research team has been trapped overnight in a storm, they're not going to be thinking clearly. Cold, fear, and isolation cause specific psychological responses. They might not respond rationally to standard rescue protocols." "Meaning what exactly?" Hartwick asked. "Meaning the rescue team needs to understand that they're not just extracting people from a dangerous location. They're dealing with individuals who may be experiencing severe psychological trauma. The approach matters as much as the route." The room had gone quiet. Irene could feel the weight of everyone's skepticism. The crying soldier who couldn't handle a simple training exercise was now trying to lecture them about psychological trauma. But General Hartwick was studying her with an expression Irene couldn't quite read. "Commander Brennan," Hartwick said, "assemble a rescue team. I want Hill included." "General, I must protest," Brennan began. "Your protest is noted and dismissed," Hartwick replied coolly. "Hill has knowledge we need. She goes." As the room erupted into activity, Irene stood frozen, unable to believe what had just happened. She was going on a real mission. Not a training exercise, not a simulation, but a genuine rescue operation where real lives hung in the balance. Victor approached her, his expression complex. "Hope you don't freeze up there, Hill," he said quietly, "because if you do, people die." Irene nodded, unable to speak, because Victor was absolutely right. And the terrifying part was that she had no idea whether she could actually function when it mattered most. As the rescue team prepared to deploy, General Hartwick pulled Irene aside. "Hill," she said, her voice low enough that only Irene could hear. "I'm taking a significant risk putting you on this team. Do you know why I'm doing it?" Irene shook her head. "Because 20 years ago, I was exactly like you. Brilliant analyst. Terrible field performance. Everyone called me a hopeless case." Hartwick's eyes held something Irene had never. "I'm expected to see their understanding. I'm giving you the chance I never had. Don't waste it." Then the general turned and walked away, leaving Irene standing alone with the weight of those words and the impossible task ahead. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The transport vehicle rumbled through the mountain roads as the rescue team made their final preparations. 6 soldiers, besides Irene, all experienced, all watching her with varying degrees of skepticism. Victor sat across from her, methodically checking his climbing gear, with the precision of someone who'd done this 100 times. Irene's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She gripped her equipment bag tighter, trying to hide the tremors, but nothing helped. The familiar panic was building in her chest, that suffocating sensation that always preceded her. Failures. What had she been thinking, speaking up in the command center? She should have stayed quiet, stayed invisible. Route assessment, barked Sergeant Emil Kovac, the team leader. He was a compact, muscular man with a face weathered by years of mountain operations. Hill, walk us through your proposed approach. Irene pulled out her map with trembling hands. Focus on the technical details, she told herself. Forget the fear. Just focus on what you know. We enter the Labska Valley here. She began, her voice shaky but gaining strength as she traced the route. The terrain rises gradually for the first 3 kilometers, which gives us time to assess conditions. At the 5-kilometer mark, we'll encounter the first real challenge, a narrow pass that could be wind affected. And if the pass is blocked? Kovac asked, his eyes never leaving her face. There's a secondary route along the eastern ridge, longer but stable. Irene's finger moved across the map with increasing confidence. The key is maintaining flexibility. The mountains will tell us which path to take. One of the other soldiers, a medic named Anna Dubois, leaned forward. What about the research team? You mentioned psychological factors? This was Irene's real expertise, the knowledge she'd accumulated during countless sleepless nights. If they've been trapped for over 12 hours in storm conditions, they're likely experiencing acute stress reactions. Disorientation, impaired judgment, possibly hypothermia-induced confusion. So they might not want to be rescued? Victor asked, his tone suggesting he thought this was ridiculous. They might not trust us, Irene corrected. They might make decisions that seem irrational. We need to approach them slowly, establish trust, not just rush in and start giving orders. Kovac studied her for a long moment, then nodded, noted. But Hill, if you freeze up there, I'm leaving you at base camp. Understood? Understood, Sergeant. The vehicle stopped at the trailhead, and the team disembarked into the cold mountain air. The sky was still clear, but dark clouds gathered on the northern horizon, promising the arrival of the next storm system. They had perhaps 5 hours, maybe 6 if they were lucky. As they began the hike, Irene fell into step at the rear of the formation. The familiar rhythm of walking helped calm her nerves slightly, one foot in front of the other. Don't think about failure, don't think about freezing, just walk. The first 3 kilometers passed without incident. The valley rose gently around them, its slopes covered in a mix of evergreen forest and exposed rock. Irene found herself noting details automatically: wind patterns, snow accumulation zones, potential hazards, all the knowledge she'd absorbed during her obsessive studies. But as they approached the narrow pass she'd identified on the map, the wind picked up dramatically. It howled through the gap between the peaks, carrying stinging particles of ice. This is worse than forecast, Kovac shouted over the wind. Hill, your assessment? Irene forced herself forward, studying the pass. The wind was dangerous but not impossible. However, something else caught her attention: a slight discoloration in the snow on the eastern slope. Sergeant, I think there's unstable snow on that slope. If we go through the pass, the wind turbulence could trigger a slide. Kovac pulled out his binoculars and studied the slope. After a moment, he swore under his breath. You're right. We take the secondary route. Victor, you're on point. Hill, you're behind Victor. If you've got knowledge of this terrain, I want you where you can use it. Victor shot her a look that mixed surprise with reluctant respect. As they began the climb along the eastern ridge, Irene felt something shift inside her. This wasn't like the training exercises. This was real, and somehow that made it different. The fear was still there, but it was background noise now, overshadowed by the urgent need to get to the research station. They climbed for another hour, the path growing steeper and more technical. Irene's physical training served her well here. her body remembering the movements even as her mind raced with calculations about time, weather, and the condition of the people they were trying to save. "Contact!" Anna suddenly called out. "I've got radio contact with the research station." The team halted as Anna worked her radio. Through the static, they could hear voices, panicked and overlapping. Anna's expression grew increasingly concerned as she listened. "They're in bad shape," she reported. 3 researchers, 1 injured, possibly hypothermic. But here's the problem. They're refusing to evacuate. They say the station contains critical data that can't be lost. "They won't leave without it," Kovac swore again. "We don't have time for this. When we get there, we extract them, data or no data." "Sergeant," Irene spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "If we force them, they might resist. Frightened people don't respond well to commands. We need a different approach. What do you suggest?" Kovac asked, his tone skeptical but not dismissive. Irene thought about all the research she'd read about crisis negotiation, about the psychology of people under extreme stress. We need to acknowledge their concerns, make them part of the solution, not obstacles to overcome. If they care about the data, we help them secure it. Then they'll trust us enough to evacuate. Victor shook his head. "That could add an hour we don't have. Forcing them could add 2 hours. If they fight us," Irene countered, "or it could get someone hurt. Trust me on this." The words hung in the cold air. Trust me. From someone who'd never earned trust, who'd failed every test that mattered. But Kovac studied her face and saw something there that made him nod. "We do it your way, Hill, but if this goes wrong, it's on you." As they resumed the climb toward the research station, Irene felt the weight of that responsibility settle onto her shoulders. Everything she'd studied, everything she'd prepared for, was about to be tested. And this time, failure wasn't an option. The research station emerged from the swirling snow like a ghost. It was a small, prefabricated structure perched on a rocky outcrop, its walls buffeted by wind, its windows dark except for the faint glow of emergency lighting. The approach was treacherous, narrow path carved into the mountainside, with steep drops on either side. "Anna, try to raise them again," Kovac ordered as the team took cover behind a rock formation 50 meters from the station. The wind had intensified and visibility was deteriorating rapidly. Anna worked her radio for several minutes before getting a response. When the voice came through, it was high-pitched and panicked, barely coherent through the static and the speaker's obvious distress. "Stay back. We're not leaving. You can't make us abandon our bod." The team exchanged glances. This was worse than they'd anticipated. Anna tried to calm the speaker, using standard reassurance protocols, but the voice only grew more agitated. "Let me try," Irene said quietly. Kovac hesitated, then handed her the radio. Victor looked like he wanted to protest, but remained silent. Irene keyed the radio, her hand surprisingly steady. "Hello, my name is Irene. I'm not here to force you to do anything. Can you tell me who I'm speaking with?" There was a long pause. Then, "Dr. Laurent, Pierre Laurent. I'm the team lead." "Dr. Laurent, it sounds like you've had a terrible night. I can only imagine how frightening it must have been." Irene's voice was soft, empathetic, nothing like the military communications protocols they'd been trained to use. "Can you tell me what happened?" Another pause, then the words came tumbling out. "The storm hit faster than predicted. Our main generator failed. Thomas, our technician, he went outside to check it and fell. His leg is broken. We got him inside, but he needs help. But we can't leave. Don't you understand? 5 years of climate data, irreplaceable observations. If we abandon the station and it's damaged, everything is lost." Irene closed her eyes, thinking. The fear wasn't about the data, not really. Dr. Laurent was using the research as a focal point, something concrete to hold on to when everything else felt out of control. She'd read about this phenomenon, how people in crisis fixated on tasks or objects as a way to maintain psychological stability. "Dr. Laurent, I understand. Your work is important. But right now, Thomas needs medical attention, and another storm is coming. We need to get everyone to safety." "You don't understand," Laurent's voice cracked. "If we lose this data, 5 years of work is meaningless. 5 years of my life wasted. I can't, I won't. You're right, Irene interrupted gently. I don't understand what it's like to dedicate 5 years to something. But I do understand what it's like to feel like a failure. To feel like everything you've worked for is about to be taken away. The radio went silent. The team stared at Irene. She wasn't following any protocol, wasn't using any of the standard crisis communication techniques. She was just being honest. I know what it's like to be called a hopeless case, Irene continued, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. To have people look at you and see only your failures. But here's what I've learned. Sometimes saving what matters means letting go of what you thought mattered. Thomas matters more than data. Your team matters more than research. And you matter more than your work. Another long silence. Then, who are you again? I'm someone who understands what it's like to be lost, Irene replied, and I'm here to help you find your way back. Kovach was watching her with an expression she'd never seen directed at her before. Not skepticism, not pity, but something approaching. Respect. Okay, Laurent finally said, his voice smaller, more vulnerable. Okay. But please, if there's any way to secure the data storage drives, we'll make it our priority, Irene promised. Can you unlock the door? We're coming in. The team moved forward carefully, Victor and another soldier taking point while Irene stayed close to Kovach. As they entered the station, they found conditions worse than expected. The interior was barely above freezing. Equipment was scattered everywhere, evidence of the panic that had gripped the researchers. Dr. Laurent was a thin man in his 40s, his face haggard with exhaustion and stress. Behind him, a young woman, presumably another researcher, sat next to an injured man on the floor. Thomas's face was pale with pain, his broken leg crudely splinted. Anna immediately moved to assess Thomas while Victor and the others began preparing for evacuation. But Irene approached Doctor. Laurent slowly, her movements non-threatening. Thank you for letting us in, she said quietly. Laurent's eyes were wet with tears. I don't know what happened to me. I couldn't think straight. All I could focus on was the data. Like if I could save that, everything would be okay. That's a normal response to trauma, Irene told him. Your brain was trying to give you something you could control when everything else felt out of control. I almost got my team killed over some hard drives, Laurent said, his voice breaking. But you didn't. You're all going to be fine. Irene placed a hand on his shoulder. Victor, can you help Dr. Laurent secure those data drives? Make sure they're weatherproof for transport. Victor looked surprised at being asked, but nodded and moved to help Laurent. As he did, Irene noticed the change in the doctor's demeanor. Having a task, being treated as competent rather than as a victim to be rescued, helped him regain his composure. Over the next 20 minutes, the team worked efficiently. Anna stabilized, Thomas for transport. The other researcher, a graduate student named Helena, was physically unharmed but deeply shaken. Irene stayed close to her, offering quiet reassurance. I thought we were going to die, Helena whispered. Pierre kept saying we couldn't leave, and I was too scared to argue with him. I felt so helpless. You're not helpless, Irene said firmly. You survived a night in a storm. You took care of your injured colleague. You held things together. That takes real strength. As they prepared to evacuate, the wind outside reached a fever pitch. The approaching storm was arriving faster than predicted. We need to move now, Kovach announced. The window is closing. The return journey would be the real test. They now had 3 civilians to evacuate, 1 seriously injured through deteriorating conditions. And somewhere in the back of Irene's mind, the old fear was whispering, this is where you fail. This is where you freeze. But as they stepped out into the storm, Thomas supported between 2 soldiers, Laurent clutching his protected data drives, Helena holding onto Irene's arm for support. Something felt different. The fear was there, but it didn't own her anymore. She'd found her purpose. Not in being fearless, but in understanding fear. Not in being strong, but in knowing how to help others find their strength. The real challenge was just beginning. The descent began smoothly enough, but 30 minutes into the evacuation, the weather turned savage. The storm that had been threatening on the horizon arrived with brutal force. bringing winds that screamed through the mountain passes and snow so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "We need to find shelter," Kovac shouted over the roar of the wind. "We'll never make it through the pass in these conditions." The team huddled together, using their bodies to shield the civilians from the worst of the wind. Thomas was conscious but deteriorating, his face ashen with pain, despite the medication Anna had administered. Laurent kept his data drives pressed against his chest like a shield, while Helena shook uncontrollably from cold and fear. "There's an emergency shelter marked on the map," Victor called out, pulling out his GPS unit. But his hands were shaking so badly from the cold that he nearly dropped it. "Should be about 200 meters east." "Should be isn't good enough," Kovac snapped. "Hill, you studied these mountains. Any knowledge of shelter locations?" Irene's mind raced through everything she'd memorized. Yes, there was a weather station emergency cache marked on the topographical surveys, but the maps were 2 years old. She couldn't guarantee it was still there or accessible. "There's a marked cache location approximately 250 meters east-northeast," she said, her voice cutting through the wind with unexpected authority. "But the approach requires crossing exposed terrain. We'd be fully in the wind for at least 5 minutes. "We don't have a choice," Kovac decided. "Victor, take point. Hill, stay with the civilians. Everyone else, tight formation. We move together or not at all." They began moving, and immediately the situation deteriorated. The wind hit them like a physical wall, threatening to knock them off their feet. Thomas cried out in pain as the soldiers carrying him struggled to maintain their footing. Helena stumbled and would have fallen if Irene hadn't caught her. "I can't do this," Helena sobbed. "I can't. Just leave me." "Look at me," Irene commanded, gripping the young woman's shoulders. "Helena, look at me. You survived last night. You can survive the next 5 minutes. I'm not leaving you, and you're not giving up. Do you understand?" Something in Irene's voice, the absolute certainty despite the chaos, made Helena nod. They pressed forward, step by agonizing step. Then Victor went down. The experienced soldier, who'd never shown a moment of weakness, simply collapsed into the snow. The team halted, confusion rippling through the group. "Victor!" Kovac moved to his side, and Irene followed. Victor's face was pale, his breathing rapid and shallow. His eyes were wide with something Irene recognized immediately: panic. "Can't breathe," Victor gasped. "Something's wrong. Heart, maybe." "Can't. He's having a panic attack," Irene said immediately. "Panic attack?" Kovac looked incredulous. "Victor's the steadiest soldier I have. He doesn't panic." "Everyone panics given the right circumstances," Irene said, already moving to Victor's side. "Victor, listen to my voice. You're not having a heart attack. Your body is responding to stress. We're going to manage this together." "You don't understand," Victor gasped. "My father, he died in the mountains. Just collapsed. I was thinking about him, about dying here, and then I couldn't breathe." I know you're scared." Irene took his hand, her voice calm despite the howling storm. "But fear is information, not fact. Your body is telling you there's danger, but you're not dying. Feel my hand. Focus on that. Now breathe with me. In for 4 counts. Hold for 4, out for 4. She breathed with him, maintaining eye contact, her hand steady in his. Around them, the storm raged, the team waited, and time ticked away. But Irene focused entirely on Victor, using every technique she'd studied about crisis intervention. Slowly, impossibly, Victor's breathing began to stabilize. The terror in his eyes faded, replaced by embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't know what happened. You experienced something traumatic," Irene said simply. "It happens to strong people too. Can you walk?" Victor nodded, using Irene's arm to pull himself up. As they resumed moving, he stayed close to her, drawing strength from her calm presence. The shelter, when they finally reached it, was a small reinforced structure half buried in snow. It took precious minutes to clear the entrance, but once inside, the relief was immediate. They were out of the wind, out of the worst of the storm. Anna immediately set about checking Thomas, whose condition had worsened during the exposure. Laurent and Helena huddled together, both near the edge of shock, and Victor sat in a corner, still looking shaken by his breakdown. Kovac pulled Irene aside. That was good work with Victor. I've served with him for 3 years. Never seen him crack like that. Everyone has a breaking point, Irene said quietly. The strong ones sometimes fall hardest because they don't recognize their own limits. Like you? Kovac asked, his tone not unkind. Irene smiled slightly. I know my limits, Sergeant. That's why I spent so long preparing to exceed them. The radio crackled to life. Firebase Dante trying to check their status. Kovac reported their situation, and the news wasn't good. The storm was intensifying and wouldn't clear for at least 6 hours. They were stuck. As the team settled in for a long wait, Irene noticed the subtle tensions building. The shelter was cramped, cold, and everyone was running on adrenaline and fear. Thomas moaned in pain despite medication. Laurent wouldn't stop checking his data drives. Helena stared at nothing. Victor avoided eye contact with everyone. This was the moment Irene had prepared for, not with physical training or technical skills, but with understanding. She moved through the shelter, speaking quietly with each person, asking about their fears, validating their emotions, helping them process what they were experiencing. You know what's interesting? Laurent said at one point, watching Irene comfort Helena. You're not what I expected from a soldier. What did you expect? Irene asked. Someone harder. Someone who'd tell us to toughen up, stop being weak. Being scared doesn't make you weak, Irene replied. Admitting you're scared and moving forward anyway, that's what makes you strong. As night fell and the storm continued to rage, outside, the small shelter became something unexpected. Not just a physical refuge, but an emotional one. A place where the facade of strength could drop, where vulnerability was acknowledged rather than punished. And at the center of it all was Irene Hill, the soldier who'd been called a hopeless case because she felt too much, using that very sensitivity to hold together a group of people who might otherwise have fallen apart. The storm finally broke just after dawn, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow and crystalline silence. The team had survived the night, but barely. Thomas's condition had stabilized but remained serious. Everyone else was exhausted, cold, and running on fumes. Firebase Dante, this is Rescue 1. Kovac spoke into the radio. We have all personnel accounted for and are preparing to resume evacuation, requesting helicopter extraction at coordinates to follow. The response came quickly. General Hartwick's voice, crisp and commanding even through the static. Negative on helicopter extraction, Rescue 1. Wind conditions are still too dangerous for flight operations. You'll need to continue on foot to Checkpoint Bravo. Ground transport will meet you there. Estimated time of arrival? Kovac looked at his team, assessing their condition, then at the terrain they'd have to cross. 4 hours, maybe 5. Understood. Hartwick out. The team prepared to move, but Irene noticed Victor sitting alone, still struggling with the aftermath of his panic attack. She approached him carefully. How are you feeling? She asked. Humiliated, Victor said bluntly. I froze, Hill, just like you always did in training. Except when you froze, there wasn't a real mission at stake. The words could have been cruel, but Victor's tone was more reflective than accusatory. I've spent months listening to people talk about how I wasn't strong enough, Irene said quietly. How my emotions made me a liability. And maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't strong enough for the missions they were planning. But it turns out I was exactly strong enough for this one. Victor looked at her, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time. You knew what to do with Dr. Laurent. You knew what to do with me. How? Because I've been where you were last night, Irene replied. I know what it feels like when your body betrays you, when fear takes over, no matter how much you want to be strong. The difference is, I've learned that feeling those things doesn't make you weak. Denying them does. The journey to Checkpoint Bravo was grueling but uneventful. The team moved slowly, accommodating Thomas's injury and the exhaustion that gripped everyone. Irene found herself naturally taking a position near the civilians, offering encouragement, monitoring their psychological state, becoming without conscious decision the emotional anchor of the group. When they finally reached the checkpoint, 3 transport vehicles were waiting, and standing beside them, having clearly made the journey herself, was General Hartwick. The general's face was unreadable as she watched the team approach. Her eyes moved over each person, assessing, calculating, When they reached Irene, they lingered. "Sergeant Kovach," Hartwick said, "I'll need a full debrief. But first, get your people warm and fed." As the team dispersed toward the waiting vehicles, Hartwick caught Irene's arm. "Walk with me, Hill." They moved away from the others toward a ridge that overlooked the valley they'd just traversed. The morning sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. "I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone at Firebase Dante," Hartwick began, her voice quiet. 23 years ago, I was a young lieutenant leading my first real mission, a simple reconnaissance operation that went wrong. We came under fire, and I froze. Completely froze. One of my soldiers died because I couldn't give in order to retreat in time. Irene remained silent, sensing this was a confession that needed no response. After that, I was terrified of freezing again. Hartwick continued. So I overcompensated, became the hardest, most demanding officer I could be. I convinced myself that if I eliminated any trace of emotion, any hint of weakness, I could never fail again. And you know what? It worked. I became successful, got promoted, earned decorations. But, Irene prompted gently, but I also became someone who saw emotions as liabilities, who dismissed soldiers like you because you reminded me of who I used to be. Hartwick turned to face Irene directly. I was wrong, Hill. Not about the importance of discipline or training, but about what makes a good soldier. What changed your mind? Irene asked. You did. When you spoke up in the command center, when you insisted on understanding the psychological state of the people we were rescuing, you weren't being weak, you were being wise. You saw something that everyone else, including me, missed. That in a crisis, technical skills matter less than human understanding. Hartwick paused, choosing her next words carefully. Kovach's preliminary report credits you with preventing the mission from becoming a disaster. Says you talked down Doctor. Laurent managed Victor's panic attack and kept the entire group psychologically stable during the night in the shelter. He's recommending you for commendation. Irene felt tears threatening, but blinked them back. I just did what needed to be done, ma'am. No, Hartwick corrected firmly. You did what no one else could have done. And that's precisely why I'm transferring you out of Firebase Dante. The words hit like cold water. Ma'am? You're being reassigned to the Crisis Response Division, Hartwick explained. We've been developing a new unit focused on psychological crisis intervention in military contexts, hostage situations, trauma response, disaster management. We need people who understand that strength isn't just physical. People like you. I don't know what to say, Irene stammered. Say yes, Hartwick replied. Because here's what I learned too late. The military doesn't just need people who can fight. It needs people who can heal, who can understand fear and work through it, who can be vulnerable and strong at the same time. We need people who know what it's like to be lost, because those are the only ones who can truly help others find their way back. They stood together in silence, watching the sunrise paint the mountains. In the distance, Irene could see the research station where this had all begun, and farther still, Firebase Dante, where she'd spent months being dismissed and underestimated. General, Irene said finally, you said you froze during your first mission. How did you move past it? Hartwick smiled, a rare expression that transformed her stern features. I'm still moving past it, Hill, every single day. The difference is, now I know. That's not a weakness. It's what makes me human. As they walked back toward the vehicles, Irene felt something shift inside her. The fear that had defined her for so long was still there, probably always would be. But now it felt different, not like a burden, but like knowledge. Not like a weakness, but like a superpower that only looked like vulnerability to people who didn't understand its value. She'd been called a hopeless case, had been dismissed, underestimated, and written off. But in the process, she'd learned something that the strong ones often missed, that being broken doesn't mean being useless. Sometimes the broken ones are the only ones who know how to fix what really matters. And sometimes the people who feel lost are exactly the ones who can become hope for everyone else who's trying to find their way. 3 weeks after the rescue mission, Irene sat in a small office at Firebase Dante, surrounded by boxes of her belongings. Her transfer to Crisis Response Division had been approved. But there was a week of administrative processing before she could leave. In that week, everything had changed. The story of the rescue had spread through the base like wildfire. Not the official version in the after-action reports, but the real story, whispered in mess halls and barracks, how the crying soldier had talked down a panicked researcher, how she'd managed Victor's breakdown when the veteran had fallen apart, how she'd held a group of terrified people together through a deadly night. At first, Irene had tried to avoid the attention. She still expected mockery, still braced herself for dismissal, but something different was happening. Soldiers she'd never spoken to were stopping her in corridors, asking questions, not about tactics or physical training, but about fear, about anxiety, about the things they'd never felt safe discussing before. A young recruit named Thomas Reller, no relation to the injured researcher, knocked on her door one morning. He stood in the doorway, shifting his weight nervously. "Specialist Hill, I'm sorry to bother you, but I heard you might understand something." Irene gestured for him to enter. "What's going on, Thomas?" The words came tumbling out. "I've been having nightmares about training exercises that haven't even happened yet. I wake up in a panic, and I can't breathe. The others in my barracks, they're starting to notice. I'm afraid they'll think I'm weak, that I can't handle the pressure." Irene recognized herself in his words, in his fear. "How long has this been happening?" 2 months. It's getting worse. I thought I could push through it, but I can't." His voice cracked. "I wanted to serve. It's all I've ever wanted. But maybe I'm not cut out for this." "Tell me something," Irene said gently. "When you're not panicking, when you're just doing regular training, how do you perform?" "Fine, I guess. Better than fine. My instructors say I have potential." "So the only thing holding you back is the fear itself?" Thomas nodded miserably. "Then you're exactly like I was," Irene told him. "And here's what I learned. Having anxiety doesn't disqualify you from service. It just means you need different tools to manage it. Have you talked to anyone? Medical staff? Counselors? I was afraid it would go in my record, that I'd be marked as unstable." Irene felt a familiar anger at the system that made soldiers hide their struggles. "Thomas, listen to me. Getting help isn't weakness. Suffering in silence until you break, that's what creates real problems. I'm going to give you the contact information for someone in the medical division who specializes in this. Someone who helped me." She wrote down the information, then added her own email. "And you can contact me anytime, even after I transfer. You're not alone in this." Thomas left looking lighter, as if simply having permission to struggle had lifted a burden. But he wasn't the last. Over the following days, more soldiers came, some with anxiety, some with depression, some just needing to talk to someone who wouldn't judge them for being human. Anna Dubois, the medic from the rescue team, found Irene in the library one evening. "I've been watching something happen," Anna said, sitting down across from her. "Ever since word got out about how you handled the mission, soldiers have been opening up about mental health issues they've been hiding for months, sometimes years. The medical division is seeing 3 times the normal number of voluntary counseling requests. Is that a problem?" Irene asked. "The opposite. It's exactly what we've needed. But the base isn't equipped for it. We have 1 counselor for 300 soldiers. The waiting list is already 2 weeks long." Anna leaned forward, her expression serious. "Hill, what you did on that mountain wasn't just save 3 civilians and a soldier having a panic attack. You showed this entire base that it's okay to not be okay. That vulnerability isn't the same as weakness. Do you have any idea how rare that is in military culture?" Irene thought about all the months she'd spent hiding her struggles, pretending to be fine while falling apart inside. "I have some idea. Before you leave for crisis response, would you consider doing something? A presentation, maybe about psychological resilience? About how to recognize when you or your teammates are struggling. The command staff has been asking. The old Irene would have panicked at the thought of standing in front of hundreds of soldiers, exposing her vulnerabilities publicly. But something had shifted during that rescue mission. She'd learned that her experiences, her struggles, weren't things to hide. They were tools she could use to help others. "I'll do it," she said. 2 days later, Irene stood in the base auditorium before an audience of over 200 soldiers. Her hands shook as she gripped the podium, but her voice was steady. 3 months ago, I was the worst performing soldier. At this base, I cried during drills. I froze during simulations. My commanding officer called me a hopeless case and recommended my discharge. She could see the surprise on faces throughout the audience. This wasn't how military presentations usually began. I want to talk to you today about why I failed. Not to make excuses, but to help you understand something important about how our minds work under stress. For the next hour, Irene shared everything. Her panic attacks, her feelings of inadequacy, the shame she'd carried, but also her research, her preparation, and what she learned about psychological resilience. She talked about Victor's breakdown, not to embarrass him, he'd given permission, but to show that even the strongest soldiers could struggle. The military trains us to be physically strong, she concluded, to push through pain, to ignore discomfort, and that's important. But we also need to train our psychological resilience, to recognize when we're struggling, to ask for help, to understand that taking care of our mental health isn't optional, it's operational readiness. The applause, when it came, was thunderous, but more meaningful were the conversations afterward. Senior officers thanking her for saying things they'd thought but never felt authorized to express. Soldiers sharing their own stories, many for the first time. Lieutenant Commander Brennan, who'd been one of her harshest critics, approached her as the crowd dispersed. "Hill, I owe you an apology. I saw your emotional responses as weaknesses to be eliminated. I was wrong. They're actually a different kind of strength. You were doing what you thought was right, sir," Irene replied. "Maybe, but right isn't always the same as correct." He paused. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't let us break you. This base needs what you showed us today." As Irene walked back to her quarters that evening, she realized that something fundamental had changed. She'd arrived at Firebase Dante, desperate to prove she could be like everyone else, strong, unshakable, fearless. Instead, she'd proven something more important, that being different wasn't a weakness. That feeling deeply, struggling openly, and refusing to pretend everything was fine could be exactly what others needed to see. The hopeless case had become something unexpected. Not despite her struggles, but because of them. The morning before Irene's transfer, Victor found her doing a final inventory check in the supply depot. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. This was where she'd spent countless hours being overlooked, considered suitable only for counting equipment. "Got a minute?" Victor asked, his tone uncertain. "Of course." Irene set down her clipboard. They walked outside into the crisp morning air. Victor was quiet for a long moment, staring at the mountains where they'd nearly died 3 weeks ago. "I've been thinking about that night in the shelter," he finally said, "about what happened to me. I've been a soldier for 6 years, Hill. 6 years of telling myself I was strong, that I had control. One moment of panic, and all of that felt like a lie." "It wasn't a lie," Irene said firmly. "You are strong. You just discovered that strength has limits. That's what I can't figure out." Victor turned to face her. "How did you manage? You dealt with panic constantly for months. How did you not just quit?" Irene considered the question carefully. "Because I had something to prove. To everyone else, but mostly to myself. That my struggles didn't define my worth. That I could contribute even if I wasn't like everyone else. And now, after everything, do you still feel like you have something to prove?" "No," Irene realized, surprised by her own certainty. "Now I just want to help people who feel like I did. Lost, broken, like they don't belong." Victor nodded slowly. "I've been sleeping badly since the mission. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that storm, feeling my heart racing, convinced I'm dying. I went to the base counselor yesterday." "That took courage," Irene said. "Funny thing about that," Victor replied with a slight smile. 3 months ago, I would have said courage was charging into enemy fire. Now I think it might actually be harder to walk into a counselor's office and admit you're struggling." They walked in companionable silence for a while. The base was waking up around them, soldiers beginning their morning routines, completely unaware that their understanding of strength was quietly being redefined. "I wanted to tell you something," Victor continued. "After my father died in the mountains, I promised myself I'd never show weakness, that I'd be strong enough for both of us. That promise nearly killed me up there. I was so busy trying to prove I was unbreakable that I didn't notice myself breaking. What changed? Irene asked. You did. When I was on the ground, convinced I was dying, you didn't try to tell me to toughen up or push through it. You just acknowledged what I was feeling and helped me through it. Like my fear was valid, not something to be ashamed of. Victor pulled a folded paper from his pocket. I wrote a letter to my mother. First time I've written to her in 2 years. I told her about the panic attack, about getting help, about learning that Dad's death wasn't something I had to carry alone. How did she respond? She said she'd been worried about me for years, that I'd become so closed off after Dad died, like I was afraid to feel anything. She's relieved I'm finally dealing with it. His voice roughened with emotion. I thought talking about it would make me weaker. Turns out, keeping it inside was what was really destroying me. Irene felt tears prick her eyes. This was why she'd endured all those months of humiliation and failure. For moments like this, for the chance to help someone else find their way through the darkness. There's something else, Victor said. I've requested a transfer to Crisis Response Division. Same place you're going. Irene looked at him in surprise. Really? I've spent 6 years being a soldier who follows orders and completes missions. Good at my job, but nothing special. But watching you on that mountain, I realized there's a different kind of soldier we need. People who understand that the enemy isn't always external. Sometimes it's internal. Fear, trauma, loss. We need people who can fight those battles too. The training is intense, Irene warned. It's not just tactical, it's psychological, emotional. You have to confront your own demons constantly. Good, Victor said firmly, because I've spent too long running from mine. Time to face them. As they walked back toward the main complex, Victor said something that would stay with Irene for years to come. You know what the real difference is between being strong and pretending to be strong? When you're actually strong, you can admit when you're not. When you're just pretending, you have to keep up the act until it breaks you. Where'd you learn that? Irene asked. From a soldier who everyone thought was too weak to matter, Victor replied with a genuine smile. Turns out she was the strongest one there. Later that day, Irene received word that 3 more soldiers had requested transfers to Crisis Response Division. The unit that had barely existed a month ago was suddenly in demand. People were starting to understand that this was the future of military service, addressing not just physical threats, but psychological ones. That evening, Sergeant Kovac found her packing the last of her belongings. Hill, I wanted you to know something. General Hartwick is establishing a permanent psychological crisis response team at Firebase Dante. She's asked me to recommend candidates. I've put forward 5 names already, including Victor. That's good, Irene said. The base needs it, more than needs it. After your presentation, voluntary counseling, requests have increased by 300%. Soldiers are finally feeling safe enough to admit they're struggling. That's a culture shift that doesn't happen often. Kovac handed her a folder. This is a letter of recommendation. Strongest one I've ever written. You saved more than 3 civilians and Victor on that mountain, Hill. You saved the idea that soldiers can be both strong and vulnerable. That's worth more than any tactical victory. As he left, Irene opened the folder and read his words. It wasn't flowery praise or exaggerated commendations. It was simple, honest assessment. Specialist Hill possesses a unique combination of technical competence and emotional intelligence that makes her ideally suited for crisis response work. She has the rare ability to see strength in vulnerability and to help others find courage in their struggles. She will be an asset to any unit fortunate enough to have her. Irene carefully filed the letter away. Tomorrow, she'd leave Firebase Dante. But she wasn't leaving behind the person who'd arrived 8 months ago, desperate and afraid. She was leaving behind the idea that there was only one way to be a good soldier. 6 months later, Irene stood in a briefing room at Crisis Response Division headquarters, a modern facility located near Vienna. The room was smaller than Firebase Dante's command center, but the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of tactical maps and weapon inventories, the walls displayed psychological assessment protocols and crisis intervention flowcharts. Around the table sat her new team, Victor, who'd completed his transfer 3 months ago, Captain Sarah Wu, a former military psychologist, Lieutenant James Fisher, a medic specializing in trauma care, and Colonel Andreas Werner, the division commander. We have a situation developing in northern Italy. Werner began pulling up satellite imagery on the main display. A military convoy was ambushed near the Austrian border. No casualties, but 12 soldiers are being held hostage in a remote farmhouse. The hostage takers are demanding prisoner releases and making increasingly erratic threats. Standard hostage situations were typically handled by tactical teams, but Werner continued with information that explained why crisis response had been called in. Intelligence indicates the hostage takers are former soldiers experiencing severe PTSD. They're not ideologically motivated, they're mentally unstable. 3 of them attempted suicide in the past year. 1 was recently discharged for psychological unfitness. The situation is volatile, but not because they're trained terrorists. It's volatile because they're desperate, traumatized people who feel they have nothing left to lose. Irene leaned forward, studying the profiles of the hostage takers on her screen. She recognized the patterns immediately: isolation, feelings of abandonment by the system, escalating mental health crises that had been ignored until they became catastrophic. "What's the current tactical approach?" Victor asked. "Standard containment. Negotiators trying to establish communication. But it's not working. The hostage takers don't trust anyone in uniform. They're convinced they'll be killed if they surrender. Because they probably believe death is preferable to going back to the system that failed them," Irene said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. These men aren't criminals. They're casualties. They need to be treated as such. "That's why you're here," Werner confirmed. "Standard protocols aren't designed for situations where the perpetrators are also victims. We need a different approach." Sarah Wu pulled up psychological profiles. Each of these men has a documented history of trauma: combat exposure, failed relationships, financial difficulties, classic warning signs that were noted but never adequately addressed. They feel betrayed by the military that promised to take care of them. So they take hostages to force someone to pay attention, James observed. "It's a cry for help that looks like an act of violence." "Exactly," Werner agreed. "Which means if we respond with pure tactical force, we confirm their belief that no one cares about them. We could trigger a tragedy." Irene studied the faces of the hostage takers on her screen. One of them, Daniel Kraus, was only 26. His file showed multiple commendations for bravery, followed by a rapid descent after witnessing a civilian casualty during a peacekeeping mission. He'd requested counseling and been told to tough it out. 3 months later, he'd been discharged for erratic behavior. "I want to talk to them," Irene said. "That's the plan," Werner confirmed. "But Hill, I need to be clear about the risks. These men are armed and unstable. The standard negotiation protocols exist for good reasons. What you're proposing, going in personally to establish trust, it could get you killed. Or it could save lives," Irene replied, "including theirs. These men don't need someone to negotiate with them. They need someone who understands what they're going through. Someone who can see them as people, not threats." Victor spoke up. "I'll go with her. If we're talking about understanding trauma, about relating to people who feel broken by the system, having 2 of us reinforces that they're not alone." Werner considered this, then nodded. "You'll have tactical support on standby. At the first sign of real danger, we extract you. Understood?" "Understood," Irene and Victor replied in unison. The flight to Italy was brief, but Irene spent it reviewing every detail of the hostage takers' files. Each man's story was different, but the pattern was the same. Soldiers who'd given everything to serve, who'd been damaged by that service, and who'd been abandoned when they needed help most. At the command post near the farmhouse, the tactical team commander briefed them on the situation. "We've had minimal communication. They know we're here, but they're not responding to negotiation attempts. The hostages are unharmed so far, but the situation is deteriorating. One of the hostage takers, Kraus, has been making increasingly suicidal statements." "I need to talk to Kraus directly," Irene said. "The communication line is open, but not over radio," Irene interrupted. "Face to face." At the door, the tactical commander looked at Werner, who'd accompanied them. Sir, that's an unacceptable risk. It's also our best chance, Verna replied. Hill knows what she's doing. 20 minutes later, Irene and Victor stood 50 meters from the farmhouse. Irene held a megaphone, but her voice was calm, not commanding. Daniel Kraus, my name is Irene Hill. I'm a specialist with Crisis Response Division. I'm not here to trick you or force you to do anything. I'm here because I understand what you're going through. I want to talk. Just talk. No weapons, no tactical teams, just me at the door. Silence. Then a voice called back, rough with stress and exhaustion. Why should I trust you? Because 3 years ago, I was called a hopeless case by my commanding officer. Irene replied, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. Because I know what it's like to feel like the military used you up and threw you away. Because I've had panic attacks in the middle of the barracks and been told to toughen up. I understand, Daniel. I really do. Another long silence. Then, come to the door, alone, hands visible. Victor gripped her arm briefly. Be careful. I will, Irene promised. As she walked toward the farmhouse, Irene felt the old fear trying to surface. But now she knew what to do with it. The fear wasn't telling her to run. It was telling her that what she was about to do mattered, that lives hung in the balance. She reached the door and knocked gently. It opened a crack, and she found herself looking into the eyes of a young man who looked decades older than his age. Daniel Kraus had the haunted look of someone who'd seen too much and been given too little help to process it. I'm here, Irene said simply, and I'm listening. Daniel Kraus stared at Irene through the cracked door, his hand visibly shaking on the weapon at his side. Behind him, she could glimpse movement, other hostage-takers positioned throughout the farmhouse, and somewhere deeper inside, the hostages themselves. You're really alone, Daniel said, his voice filled with disbelief. They actually let you come alone. I asked to come alone, Irene replied gently, because I meant what I said. I'm not here as a tactical threat. I'm here as someone who understands. Understands what? Daniel's voice cracked. You can't possibly understand what this is like. Tell me, Irene said simply. Help me understand. For a long moment, Daniel just stared at her. Then, slowly, he opened the door wider. Come in. But if this is a trick, if there are snipers or tactical teams, there aren't. I promised you that. I keep my promises. Irene stepped inside, and the door closed behind her. The interior of the farmhouse was dim, windows covered with blankets. 3 other men were visible, all armed, all looking exhausted and desperate. In a corner, she could see the hostages, 12 soldiers sitting on the floor, their hands zip-tied but otherwise unharmed. One of the other hostage-takers, a man in his early 30s with sergeant stripes still visible on his jacket, pointed his weapon at her. Marcus, this is insane. She's probably wearing a wire. This is a tactical play. My name is Jorg, he said to Irene, his voice tight with tension. And I'm not stupid enough to believe you just want to talk. I do just want to talk, Irene replied, keeping her voice calm despite her racing heart. But if you don't believe me, you can check for wires. I'm not armed. I'm not recording anything. I'm just here. Jorg moved forward and conducted a brief search, confirming what Irene had said. He stepped back, confused. Why? Why would you come in here without backup, without protection? Because you need someone to listen, Irene said, addressing all of them now. And listening doesn't work when you're hiding behind tactical gear negotiation protocols. It only works when you're present, vulnerable, willing to risk something. She moved slowly to an empty chair and sat down, making herself comfortable despite the weapons trained on her. I know your stories, all of you. Daniel witnessed a civilian casualty. That wasn't his fault, but haunts him anyway. Jorg, you reported sexual assault in your unit and were retaliated against until you couldn't take it anymore. Lucas, she nodded toward a younger man near the window. Your best friend died in your arms during a training accident, and you were told to get over it and move on. The room had gone silent. The men stared at her with expressions mixing shock and something like hope. How do you know all that? Lucas whispered. Because I read your files. Every request for help you made. Every time you tried to tell someone you were struggling. Every time you were ignored or dismissed. Irene's voice remained gentle but carried absolute conviction. And I'm here to tell you something important. You were right. The system failed you. You deserved better. You deserved help, understanding, treatment, and you didn't get it. Daniel's weapon lowered slightly. Then you understand why we're doing this. Why we had to make them pay attention. I understand why you felt you had no other choice, Irene agreed. But Daniel, this isn't going to end the way you hope. You know that. Even if your demands are met, even if prisoners are released, you'll never be free. This action has painted you as criminals, not as the veterans in crisis that you actually are. So what? Georg said bitterly. We were already criminals in their eyes. Damaged goods, problems to be swept under the rug. At least this way, people have to acknowledge we exist. People are acknowledging you, Irene replied, but not in the way that helps. Right now, you're being seen as threats, not victims. The narrative being written about you is that you're dangerous, unstable, violent. That's going to be used to justify ignoring the real issues. To prove that veterans with PTSD shouldn't be supported because look what happens. She leaned forward, her eyes moving from face to face. But there's another way this can end. One where your stories actually create change. Where the system that failed you is forced to do better. How? Lucas asked, and Irene heard the desperate hope in his voice. You let the hostages go, you surrender, and I promise you, personally promise you, that your stories will be heard. Not as criminals, but as soldiers who were failed by the system they served. I'll make sure of it. Promises from the military mean nothing, Georg spat. We were promised care, we were promised support, all lies. You're right, Irene agreed. The military did lie to you, but I'm not offering you a promise from the military. I'm offering you a promise from me. And I've been where you are. I know what it's like to feel hopeless, to feel like no one sees you or cares. I clawed my way out of that darkness, and I did it by refusing to let the system's failures define my worth. You can too. Daniel sat down heavily, his weapon finally lowering completely. I'm so tired, he said, his voice breaking. I'm so tired of fighting, of pretending I'm okay, of trying to survive each day. I know, Irene said softly. I know you are. And you don't have to fight anymore. Not like this. Let me help you. Let me help all of you. They'll arrest us, Lucas said. We'll go to prison. Probably, Irene admitted, because lying would destroy any trust she'd built. But prison with proper mental health treatment is better than dying here. And I'll fight to make sure you get that treatment. I'll testify about the failures that led to this. I'll make sure your stories are part of the conversation about how we treat veterans. For a long moment, no one spoke. Irene could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air. These men had reached the end of their rope, had made a desperate play for attention, for validation, for someone to care. Everything hinged on whether they believed that someone finally did. Daniel looked at his companions, then back at Irene. If we do this, if we surrender, you'll really make sure people know what drove us to this? You'll fight for us? I will, Irene promised. Not to excuse what you've done, but to explain it. To make sure the next soldier who's struggling gets help before they reach this point. And the hostages? Georg asked. They weren't part of this. We never wanted to hurt them. Then let them go. Show that despite everything, you're still soldiers who protect rather than harm. Another silence, this one stretched so thin Irene thought it might break. Then Daniel stood up and moved toward the hostages. It's over, he said quietly, beginning to cut their zip ties. We're sorry. This was never about you. As the hostages were freed and began moving toward the door, Irene remained seated, making no move to leave until all 4 hostage takers had laid down their weapons. Only when the last gun was on the floor did she stand. Thank you, she said simply. You made the right choice. Now let's get you the help you should have had all along. 2 months after the hostage situation, Irene stood before a European Defense Committee hearing in Brussels. The room was formal and intimidating, filled with high-ranking officers, government officials, and media representatives. This was the promise she'd made to Daniel, Georg, Lucas, and the others, that their stories would be heard at the highest levels. Colonel Werner sat in the front row, offering silent support. Victor was there too, along with several others from crisis response. Division. But the person Irene was most aware of was General Hartwick, who'd flown in specifically for this testimony. Specialist Hill, the committee chair began. You've been asked here to provide insight into the incident in northern Italy. Specifically, the committee wants to understand how a hostage situation involving armed veterans was resolved without casualties. Please proceed. Irene took a breath, steadying herself. The old fear of public speaking tried to surface, but she pushed it down. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about every soldier who'd ever struggled and been ignored. Thank you. I want to start by acknowledging that what Daniel Kraus and his companions did was wrong. Taking hostages is never acceptable. But I also want the committee to understand that this situation was preventable. It was the inevitable result of systematic failures in how we support veterans with mental health challenges. She pulled up the first slide of her presentation, showing the documented requests for help that each hostage taker had made before the incident. Daniel Kraus requested counseling 12 times over 18 months. Each time, he was told to wait, to tough it out, or that resources were unavailable. Georg Richter reported sexual assault and retaliation, which was documented but never adequately investigated. Lucas Meyer witnessed a training accident and developed severe PTSD, for which he received 2 counseling sessions before being told to return to full duty. The committee members shifted uncomfortably as she continued documenting the failures. These men didn't wake up one day and decide to become criminals. They deteriorated over months, sometimes years, while the system watched and did nothing. The hostage situation wasn't the problem. It was the symptom. The problem is that we train soldiers to fight external enemies but abandon them when they're fighting internal ones. One committee member, a general with decades of service, spoke up. Specialist Hill, are you suggesting that every veteran with mental health challenges is a potential threat? Absolutely not, Irene replied firmly. I'm suggesting the opposite. When we provide proper support, veterans with mental health challenges are assets, not threats. I'm living proof of that. I was recommended for discharge due to anxiety and panic disorders. Instead of being dismissed, I received support and training. Now I lead a crisis response team. How many other soldiers are we losing because we see their struggles as disqualifications rather than opportunities? She advanced to her next slide, showing statistics. Since Firebase Dante implemented comprehensive mental health support 6 months ago, voluntary counseling requests increased by 300%. Simultaneously, disciplinary issues decreased by 40%, and performance scores improved across the board. Soldiers who feel supported perform better. It's that simple. Another committee member asked, what specific recommendations would you make to prevent situations like the Italy incident? Irene had prepared extensively for this question. First, mandatory mental health screenings, not just once during intake, but regularly throughout service. Second, sufficient counseling resources. The current ratio of 1 counselor per 300 soldiers is inadequate. Third, cultural change. We need to normalize mental health care the same way we normalize physical fitness training. Fourth, specialized crisis response teams like the one I'm part of, trained to recognize and intervene before situations become critical. And the cost? Someone asked. Is substantially less than the cost of incidents like Italy, Irene replied, both in terms of resources and in terms of human lives. We can either invest in prevention or pay for crisis response. Prevention is cheaper and more humane. For the next hour, Irene answered questions, defended her recommendations, and told the stories of soldiers she'd worked with. She talked about Thomas Reller, the young recruit who'd come to her terrified that his anxiety would end his career, who was now thriving with proper support. She talked about Victor, about Dr. Laurent and his team, about every person she'd encountered who'd been helped by someone willing to see their struggles as valid rather than dismissible. When the hearing concluded, the committee chair said, Specialist Hill, your testimony has been noted. The committee will take your recommendations under advisement. It was the standard political non-answer, but Irene saw something in the faces around the room that gave her hope. She'd planted seeds. Whether they grew would depend on many factors beyond her control, but she'd kept her promise. The stories had been told at the highest levels. As she left the chamber, General Hartwick intercepted her in the hallway. That was remarkable, Hill. You didn't pull any punches. With respect, General, the time for pulling punches is over. Soldiers are dying because we're too uncomfortable to have honest conversations about mental health. Hartwick smiled slightly. 20 years ago, if someone had testified the way you just did, they would have been quietly drummed out of service. Times are changing. People like you are changing them. Not just me, Irene replied, thinking of everyone who'd shared their stories, who'd been brave enough to admit they were struggling. This is bigger than any one person. True, but every movement needs someone to stand up first. Someone brave enough to be vulnerable publicly. That was you, Hill. Don't minimize that. As Irene walked out of the building into the Brussels afternoon, her phone buzzed with messages. Thomas Reller texting that he'd watched the hearing online and felt inspired. Anna Dubois sharing that Firebase Dante was creating 2 new counselor positions. Victor sending simply, "You did it. You kept your promise." But the message that meant the most came from an unknown number. "This is Daniel Kraus. I watched your testimony from the detention facility. Thank you for not forgetting us. Thank you for making our pain mean something. You gave me hope that maybe I'm not just a criminal. Maybe I can still be someone who matters." Irene read the message twice, tears blurring her vision. This was why she'd endured all those months of failure and humiliation, why she'd walked alone into a farmhouse full of armed, desperate men, why she'd stood before a committee and exposed not just their failures, but her own vulnerabilities. Because somewhere, someone who felt hopeless was watching. Someone who felt like a lost cause was listening. And they needed to see that broken doesn't mean worthless, that struggling doesn't mean failing, that sometimes the people who've been through the darkness are exactly the ones who can light the way for others. The general had called her a hopeless case. She'd proven him wrong. But more importantly, she'd proven wrong the voice in her own head that had told her she wasn't enough, that her sensitivity was weakness, that her struggles disqualified her from making a difference. She was enough. She always had been. She just needed to stop trying to be like everyone else and start being fully, authentically herself. 1 year after the Brussels testimony, Irene stood on a stage at the newly established European Military Mental Health Summit. The venue was packed with soldiers, officers, mental health professionals, and policymakers from a dozen countries. This wasn't a small base presentation or a committee hearing anymore. This was a movement. When I joined the military, I thought strength meant never showing weakness, Irene began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. I thought being a good soldier meant pushing through pain, hiding struggles, and pretending everything was fine even when it wasn't. I was wrong. And that misunderstanding nearly destroyed me. On the screen, behind her, images appeared. Firebase Dante's original single counselor office, now expanded to a full mental health center. The Crisis Response Division, grown from a handful of specialists to over 50 trained professionals across Europe. Most powerfully, photographs of soldiers who'd come forward with their own stories, faces of people who'd chosen hope over silence. This past year, we've seen remarkable changes. 23 military installations have implemented comprehensive mental health programs. Voluntary counseling requests have increased by 400% across European forces. And most importantly, we've prevented 14 situations that could have become crises like the one in Italy. Victor sat in the front row, now a senior specialist in crisis response. Next to him was Thomas Reller, who not only overcome his anxiety, but had become a peer counselor, using his own experiences to help other struggling recruits. Anna Dubois had transitioned to crisis response, as well, bringing her medical expertise to bear on trauma care. But numbers only tell part of the story. Irene continued, the real story is in the individual lives changed. The soldier who finally got treatment for PTSD after a decade of suffering and silence. The officer who learned that asking for help made him a better leader, not a weaker one. The recruit who discovered that her sensitivity wasn't a liability, but a strength that made her exceptionally good at understanding others. In the audience, General Hartwick watched with an expression of quiet pride. She'd retired from active command to lead the new European Military Wellness Initiative, using her position to institutionalize the changes that had started with one struggling soldier on a remote base. "I want to share something personal," Irene said, her voice softening. "A year ago, I received a message from Daniel Kraus, one of the men involved in the Italy incident. He was writing from a military detention facility where he was serving his sentence. But he was also receiving comprehensive mental health treatment for the first time in his life. He wrote to tell me that he'd found hope again, that he was learning to live with his trauma rather than be consumed by it, that he believed he could still become someone who contributed positively to the world." She paused, letting the words settle. "Last month, Daniel completed his sentence. He's now working with a veteran support organization, using his experience to help other soldiers in crisis. The man who was once so desperate that he took hostages is now saving lives, because someone finally saw him as worth saving." The audience was silent, completely focused on her words. That's what this movement is really about. It's about recognizing that every person struggling with mental health challenges isn't a lost cause or a liability. They're someone with unique insights into human suffering, which makes them uniquely qualified to help others who are suffering. We don't need to fix them or change them. We need to support them and value what they have to offer. Irene clicked to her final slide, showing a single quote. "Sometimes the broken ones know exactly how to find the lost. The general called me a hopeless case. And in that moment, standing in his office, being told I wasn't good enough, I believed him. I believed that my struggles made me worthless, that my emotions made me weak, that my inability to push through panic like everyone else meant I'd never matter. But I was wrong. And so was he." She looked directly at the audience, making eye contact with as many people as possible. If you're watching this and you're struggling, if you feel lost or broken, or like you don't belong, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not hopeless. Your struggles don't disqualify you. They qualify you. Because the people who know what it's like to be lost are exactly the ones who can become hope for everyone else trying to find their way. The military taught me many things, but the most important lesson I learned came from my failures, not my successes. I learned that vulnerability isn't the opposite of strength. It's the foundation of it. I learned that the courage to admit you're struggling is greater than the courage to pretend you're fine. And I learned that sometimes the people everyone writes off are exactly the ones who change everything. As Irene concluded her speech, the applause was thunderous, but she barely heard it. She was thinking about the emails she'd receive in the coming days from soldiers around Europe who'd watched this summit online. Some would thank her, some would share their stories. Some would simply say, "Me too. I thought I was alone." After the summit, a small reception was held for speakers and guests. Irene found herself surrounded by people wanting to share their experiences, ask questions, or simply shake her hand. But the encounter that mattered most came from an unexpected source. A young soldier, barely 20, approached her nervously. "Specialist Hill, I'm Private Emma Thorson. I just want to thank you. 6 months ago, I was planning to end my life. I'd been having panic attacks, and I was terrified to tell anyone because I thought I'd be discharged. Then I saw a video of your Firebase Dante presentation. The way you talked about your struggles, it made me realize I wasn't broken. I got help. And now I'm here, at this summit, learning how to be the kind of soldier who helps others." Irene felt tears threatening, but smiled through them. "Emma, thank you for sharing that with me. And thank you for choosing to stay. The military needs people like you. People like us," Emma corrected gently. "We're not separate anymore. We're changing what people like us means." As the reception wound down, Victor found Irene standing alone on a balcony, looking out over the city. "Thinking deep thoughts?" he asked, joining her. "Thinking about how far we've come," Irene replied. "A year ago, I was the crying soldier that nobody wanted on their team. Now I'm standing here after addressing a summit of thousands, and people are listening. You know what I think changed?" Victor said. "Nothing about you. You were always this person, always had this wisdom and strength. What changed is that other people finally recognized it, finally saw what was there all along." Irene smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe I needed to go through everything I did to become who I am now. The struggles, the failures, the moments where I thought I couldn't continue. Maybe all of that was necessary. To become hope for the hopeless? Victor suggested. To become proof, Irene corrected, that hopeless doesn't exist. That as long as you're breathing, you have the chance to transform your pain into purpose. To take everything that broke you and use it to help others heal. They stood together in comfortable silence as the sun set over the city. Tomorrow, Irene would return to Crisis, Response Division Headquarters. There would be more missions, more soldiers in crisis, more opportunities to prove that strength comes in many forms. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply feel proud of how far she'd come. The general had been wrong. She wasn't a hopeless case. She was hope itself for everyone who'd ever felt lost, broken, or not good enough. And that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.